I'm Ben Heap from the NATO Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence. Well, following the NATO leaders meeting in London in 2019, Jens Stoltenberg took on the task of a review, a reflection, not quite a review of the strategic concept, the most recent one from that being in 2010, but a look forward to 2030 and NATO relevance over the next 10 years and beyond. It's designed to reflect on where we see our alliance 10 years from now, and it will also continue to look at how to keep us safe in a more uncertain world, ensuring that NATO stays strong militarily and be more united politically and take a broader approach globally. The reflection process will take input from 10 experts. It's due to be completed by the end of the year, and then it will provide input for the summit next year in 2021. More recently, in June of this year, EU defence ministers agreed to develop a strategic compass, a new strategy defining new EU aims in security and defence policy, facilitating a more rapid response in the event of a security crisis. A common way of looking at the world, of defining threats and challenges as the basis for addressing them together. And these strategic guidelines, they're due to be used as a basis to determine which instruments and capabilities the EU needs in the future. The compass, supposed to be adopted by European leaders during the French presidency in the first half of 2022, will build on a comprehensive threat analysis due by the end of this year. And of course, dominating the agenda through all of this, a pandemic which has brought into sharp relief the European Union's dependencies and structural weaknesses, putting economic pressure on national budgets, which will likely have a knock-on effect to future defence spending. And of course, a relationship between Europe and the US, which has at times looked quite strained. So the requirement for a collective response here is rather obvious. The boundaries of what can be defined as security and defence are no longer so clear-cut. There are a raft of developing issues that need unified and resolute approaches. China, cyber, digital rights, counter-terrorism and climate change. There are competencies within organisations and member states that complement and reinforce each other. However, the different lanes in which everyone should be swimming are not always so clear. So, what should we expect from NATO's reflection process and the EU's search for its strategic compass? With me today to discuss the threat landscape of the future, NATO's 2030 reflection, its relationship with the European Union, and the outlook for transatlantic relations, I have with me the Honourable Ron Johnson, Senator for Wisconsin, Chair of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation, Ambassador Baiba Braja, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, Anna Fotyga, Member of the European Parliament and former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Poland, and Dr. Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer, who's Director of Research for Transatlantic Security and Director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So you'll be familiar with the format. Each of our contributors will have a few minutes to provide opening remarks, and then we will have some questions and a discussion. So over to you, Ron Johnson.
Well, good afternoon. Let me start my remarks by quoting Secretary General Stoltenberg in his remarks to a joint session of Congress a couple of years ago, where he began and ended his speech by saying, "It is good to have friends." I would modify that slightly to say it is crucial to have friends. As our moderator began the program, it's obvious that a collective response is required. And what I can tell you, and of course, I, as chairman of the subcommittee on European affairs, as part of Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I meet with multiple delegations from all over Europe. And certainly since the start of the Trump administration, I've had to continue to reassure those delegations that the support for NATO, for our alliances, for that collective response is strong and is bipartisan. It didn't change during the Trump administration. It won't change moving forward. So let me start out by saying that I believe it's crucial to have friends. I believe it's crucial that we require a collective response. And I think NATO has proven itself to be a crucial vehicle for that collective response in the past, and it will continue to play that role probably more than ever in the future as well. Now, I realize many Europeans had a problem with President Trump's policy of America first. I don't think they completely understood what he meant by it. They don't particularly like his tweets, some of his rhetoric, his style. He's a New York street fighter. But I think, as Lindsey Graham pointed out in a Munich conference a couple of years ago, set aside the bombast, set aside the tweets, the style, and take a look at the results. I think the results have actually been quite impressive. For example, prior to the Trump administration, there are 4 or 5 NATO countries that are meeting that 2% of spending. The result of the pressure, I think, put on by President Trump, by the way, he is speaking for the American people in making this request. Now we have, by the end of 2020, I think 10 NATO nations will be meeting that 2%. Overall, NATO and U.S. defense spending has increased by 0.35%. Now that's pretty significant. And unfortunately, in a growing, more dangerous world, that kind of defense spending is going to be required, because it really is, you achieve peace through strength. And I think collectively, NATO is showing that we intend to achieve peace through strength and collective effort. If you just compare what the Trump administration the results it has achieved versus the previous administration, I just kind of go down the list. Ukraine, during the Obama Biden administration, Crimea was illegally annexed, and Russia invaded eastern Ukraine. And the Obama administration did not utilize the authorization for lethal defensive weaponry that Congress did provide. The Trump administration did, and at least we haven't seen further incursions by the Russians. That is, another one of those frozen conflicts, but has not progressed further. Libya, the Obama administration was part of the destruction of that structure. It's being stabilized, and through efforts of our European partners, hopefully we'll have a peace agreement there. Syria, a rebellion that was resulting in hundreds and thousands of lost lives, blew into a genocide that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. That is a more stable situation. Far from being solved, but it's more stable. The Trump administration moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and the world didn't explode. In fact, unbelievably, to most people, Israel actually is now recognized by a number of Arab states. We have greater peace agreements. I know people disagree with me on this, but I personally thought the JCPOA was a disastrous agreement, funneling $100 billion or more into the economy and military of the largest state-sponsored terror. Trump administration withdrew from that. We've increased pressure on Iran as a result. I hope we take advantage of that, and I hope we don't go back to the previous situation. The testing within North Korea was rampant during the Obama administration. It's been reduced, which is a good thing. Still not a problem solved. We need collective response to that. Russia continues to misbehave. We need collective response. I do hope that our European partners will support our efforts in Congress, so we'll have additional sanctions, part of the National Defense Authorization Act, to increase sanctions on anybody cooperating with the Nord Stream 2. We should stop that. That destabilizes Europe. And of course, China represents a growing and enormous threat. I think we're all coming to recognize it, the dangers of things like Huawei, 5G intrusions. We should collectively work with companies like Nokia, Ericsson, other suppliers to make sure that we don't allow Huawei to invade our telecommunications systems and create greater instability. To conclude, let me talk about how crucial it is to have economic security if we have any hope of achieving national security. And of course, that brings up the pandemic. I'm going to be holding a hearing on Thursday in my Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee, really talking about the fact that we need effective early treatments for COVID. It has been from my standpoint, the greatest missed opportunity. It's encouraging to have a vaccine that may be as much as 90% effective. That's great. That'll be that'll take us a long way down the road to putting COVID behind us. But people will continue to get sick, and a small percentage of those people will get seriously ill, and their lives will be threatened if we don't have effective early treatment. We all know that a product called Tamiflu needs to be administered early in a flu virus if it's going to be effective. It's boggled my mind. I think it's become politicized because President Trump uttered the words hydroxychloroquine, that as time goes by is being proven potentially effective, but we've completely ignored, and we haven't explored the possibility of that, or ivermectin, or zinc, or other natural supplements that could be effective early in the treatment, because we politicize that issue. So I certainly hope that the medical community, I hope governments pay far more attention to early treatment, early intervention as part of the overall solution to get us beyond the COVID pandemic, the economic devastation, the human toll that has taken on all of us. So we have a final solution on COVID, and then look forward to better governmental policies, a reasonable level of regulation, a reasonable level of taxation, so we can have strong economies, growing economies, so that we can have a strong economy and strong national security. But again, thank you for allowing me to participate in this conference.
Senator, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us. There are 2 points that jump out from what you've been talking about there that I think we will end up returning to later on. One's the 2% figure, and whether that's an appropriate or a useful metric for the future, given that defense, the definition of what is defense and security isn't quite what it was 20 or 30 years ago, and whether this 2% is really the right metric to use for capability development. And the other is on sanctions, because I know you're on record as having issues in which the way sanctions have been implemented against Russia, and I'm wondering if there's, how we develop the EU dimension of that, and how they would be involved in the use of an economic instrument in order to influence, to leverage strategic influence. So those are a couple of things that you've mentioned that I'd like us to come back later. But if we could move on now to, I believe, Biber, who's in Brussels. Biber, please, let's hear from you.
Labvakar, Latvia.
Labvakar.
Good evening, Latvia. Hello, Washington. Hello, America. And good day, Warsaw and Paris. And I would like to wish Latvia a happy 102nd birthday, which is in a few days ahead of us. Daudz laimes dzimšanas dienā Latvijā. Of course, I miss being back in Riga, but I'm very pleased to be with you tonight and to be able to engage and discuss with everyone. As Ben rightly pointed out, the adaptation is the word of the current times, and NATO is not exception to that. NATO adapts. NATO has adapted throughout more than 70 years of its history, and we will adapt in the future. We have guaranteed peace and security to our populations, to our countries, and we will continue doing that. The Allies are united. It's the strongest military political alliance in the world. And that is why we have started the process that we call 2030, where we are awaiting with great impatience the experts group reports that will come in the next few weeks. And Secretary General from that will form his recommendations for the next summit and possibly for the next strategic concept, as he announced this morning in the Riga conference, that indeed NATO will develop a new strategic concept. For now, we have clearly seen that the threat environment has expanded, while the traditional threats are there, from military force and change of borders in Europe by hybrids and also by active military actions. In the same time, we have seen that activities below the military threshold, below the Article 5 threshold, have expanded significantly. Enabled by the cyberspace, enabled by the networks and digital environment. We have seen how pandemic has affected the whole world, how it has also changed the way people communicate, how disinformation has spread consciously, but also misinformation. And of course, climate change is a threat multiplier. Also, no doubt that NATO has discussed issues that were not there on the agenda, such as China. The global power balance is shifting with the rise of China. We don't see China as an adversary, but we also know that China poses both challenge and opportunities to our security and in terms of our economies and in terms of values, military modernization, resilience. So let's keep in mind that China has the second largest defense budget in the world and is investing heavily in the new capabilities. It's also heavily present in the cyberspace. It's expanding in Arctic, in Africa. So we take it seriously. So we are looking at China also. It doesn't mean, again, that we see China as an adversary, but we clearly know that it's not only Russia that has shown with its unpredictable behavior, with its military capabilities, but also China that has created new challenges to NATO. The best way to address is by Europe, North America, and global partners working together. We present, together with America, Europe and America, the world's half economic might, and of course, half of the military might of the world. We are stronger when we are together. We are stronger on the global stage, but we are also stronger because we understand that issues such as maintaining international system, stability of international system, our international commitments is so important. A few words on the NATO 2030. As you, Ben, rightly said, Secretary General has launched the process of consultation and reflection, and we all together call it 2030 vision. I think it will include the very distinguished experts report. It includes our discussions with youth audiences, with our future leaders. Secretary General has formed a group of youth leaders also to engage and discuss. They come from a variety of think tanks and backgrounds. And if you watched the Youth Summit just this Monday, for the first time NATO held it, it was most informative and very, very interesting. It discussed everything from nuclear deterrence to climate change, to resilience, to tricking the trolls and strategic communications, so everything. But quite clearly for NATO, to stay strong militarily, more united politically, and with a global approach is the way to adapt to the future. With this, I would like to conclude my introductory remarks and to leave more time actually for the questions and discussions.
Baiba, thank you very much. Latvia misses you as well, if I might say so.
Paldies.
Also. Now I'm hoping Anna Fatiga is going to be joining us because she's been one of the experts that we've referred to in the review process. And I was hoping that she'd be able to spill some of the secrets about what's going on. Because she's been working, the reason that she's only be able to dip in is because she's actually working on the review today as we speak. So she joins us live from the review process. Anna, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Now the floor is yours. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to give us some indication of how this process has been going and what's involved.
Well, it's almost the last day of our deliberations. It's final touches to the draft report. Now, what we expect is a presentation to SecGen, NAC, and then NATO Ministerial that is to be convened on December 1st, 2nd. So it is actually almost daily sessions. Hopefully, we are able to call this good result, and hopefully NAC and foreign ministers and then heads of states and governments of allied nations are to accept this. It probably should be also the good departure for work over the strategic concept. I think I can share this view that we consider the recent strategic concept as outdated. To remind you, it was adopted before the Russian aggression on Ukraine, illegitimate, illegal annexation of Crimea. And there were many lessons learned afterwards. By the way, it's not even mentioning the rise of China, not properly indicating terrorism and so on. So we strongly feel, I can speak on my own behalf now, but I think that all members share my view that many areas that are provided in current strategic concept are outdated and have to be put in the new version. So we hope that allied leaders depart on this work. Well, I think that in particular countries, allies of my region, Central and Eastern Europe, greetings to friendly Riga. I really regret I'm not able to make it in person, but certainly almost during our consultations with allied capitals, all representatives stressed necessity to enhance, to strengthen transatlantic bond, to uphold what was provided in the Washington Treaty. I think that this vision is shared both sides of Atlantic, and NATO for more than 7 decades have been the most successful security, so defense, political defense alliance, keeping us together and binding around shared values and shared perception of threats. There are some differences in this, and we strongly feel it is necessary to strengthen consultation and discussions among allies on important issues. Here there are obviously matters, issues to debate also among American and European allies. There are tensions even among allies, and that is to be dealt with by both SecGen and eventually interested allies. We have to keep stronger cohesion and resolve to act together in order to cope with existing and emerging threats. We strongly intend also to make a step forward with in reference to new technologies and to elevate this issue. Although much of this work has been already done at NATO level. In our region, in Central and Eastern Europe, still persisting threat from Russian Federation is the most important issue. Russia remains the major military threat to the alliance, and therefore we are strongly interested in all endeavors on NATO level and in other formats to strengthen the both forward presence and NATO flank without prejudice to other areas, because we want to see also what is happening in our southern neighborhood, in particularly in eastern part of Mediterranean. In terms of raising China, I think that it is extremely important to also to make it very firm how we treat our partnerships, in particular with like-minded countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan. But certainly, probably in order to see other possibilities to guard freedom of navigation, to keep the southern route navigable. We have to eventually engage in closer cooperation with countries like India. I am personally very strongly supporting this view. Many countries of our region, of Central and Eastern Europe, are very much interested in cooperation with Taiwan. I think that in particular in time of pandemia, there is much to learn from Taiwan. This country have much to offer in terms of public health, having enormous tradition. Some of this also of Polish origin, because a Polish scholar and renowned bacteriologist was creating the Chinese and Taiwanese public health and anti-epidemics measures sometime decades ago, and that is something Taiwan can offer all of us. So it is worth cooperating with this. I personally very strong support enhanced partners, EOP, enhanced partnership with Georgia and Ukraine. It is specific to not only to our region. Hopefully, all allies support this. Both countries undergoing very difficult reforms, in the same time face already throughout years. In Ukraine, it is 6 years, over 6 years, aggression of Russia and combining both. So combining the combating aggression and in the same time undergoing very challenging internal reforms requires our attention, assistance, and solidarity.
Anna, I'm mindful of the fact that we only have you for the intervention, and I wondered if when you were speaking to the capitals, you've already mentioned the one theme that came up of the importance of the transatlantic alliance. What were the other themes that you had coming from the capitals when you were doing the rounds and talking to them as part of this reflection process?
Well, it was, of course, cooperation between NATO and the EU. It is not so seamless, I would say, and requiring much attention. I think that the notion of strategic autonomy as a matter of discussion between in transatlantic format in particular. That has to be put more precise by the EU, I think. I know that within strategic concept, within strategic compass, that is a matter of deliberations within the EU. It is to be tackled, but certainly we need cohesion, we need avoiding duplication, and we need certain solidarity of so-called political West. Simply, that is why it is so important, and countries of Central and Eastern Europe are there much for this. I'm very sorry. I have to rush once more.
Thank you very much. Thank you for Anna, thank you for taking the time out to join us, and I'm sorry that you'll miss the discussion.
Sorry, I would love to be there, but
no,
it is.
I think we understand you have more important matters in hand. Thank you very much, Anna. I'm hoping that Dr. Alexandra, Alexandra, hello. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
The floor is yours, Alex.
Thank you. So I just heard the word strategic autonomy, and as a French, I need to react to that, obviously. No, but I wanted to tackle that issue in particular. I mean, the Trump presidency has clearly been, a time of what I would call clarification on both sides, on the US side and the European side, and therefore within NATO. It has been a clarification of US strategic interests, and it has also been a clarification for us Europeans in a way that I think, one of the legacies, if we could take from the Trump presidency, is that we have probably become slightly more assertive in saying our disagreements with Washington's policies when they contradict our priorities or our security interests, and in also explaining the policies that we would rather follow, and that really goes in all spheres: climate, Iran, arms control. We've mentioned China, technological issue. I've been working in the transatlantic relation now for almost 15 years, and I must say that these last 4 years, the conversation, the transatlantic dialogue has become much more direct, much more straightforward, which to a certain extent is a good thing. Trump officials say, that this is kind of the end of hypocrisy within the transatlantic relationship. But as we are heading towards a Biden administration, I think we have to be careful to keep that sort of political diplomatic autonomy that we have learned to develop as Europeans. And so this sort of intra-European conversation, initiatives about strategic autonomy is not, another example of what some of our European neighbors, see as a French hubris. It's not a choice. It has become a necessity. And strategic autonomy is not anti-NATO. It's not anti-United States. It's really about thinking as we Europeans, member of NATO, what are the values that we are defending and what are our priorities, and anticipating, and this is really something I want to underline, the scenarios where the United States will say, sorry, this is not in our vital interest to follow you or to deploy military force. And there are also scenarios where NATO is sometimes not the most adequate organization to respond to a certain situation. And I think that Libya 2011, Syria 2013 were kind of precursors of that trend. And we've mentioned the southern flank of NATO. I think this particularly true in the southern flank. And, sitting here in Paris, obviously we have a very, southern look to the challenges, but that's also due to the proximity and to the very, heightened tensions that we've been experiencing in the Mediterranean. So that to me is really important. And one of the questions that you asked to the panel was, does that lead to a division of labor between NATO and the EU, between the United States and Europeans? I would answer that, in the Washington perspective, the ideal division of labor would actually be a geographical division of labor, where Washington could really concentrate on China and the Asia Pacific, and Europeans could take care of their neighborhoods, Eastern and Southern. But I believe that this geographical division of labor is in fact not possible. It's not implementable. And rather of talking of division of labor, I would rather talk of responsibility sharing within a transatlantic framework. I think that the transatlantic partnership should really start working on, a positive agenda, looking at the neighborhoods of Europe, but also looking at China, and define a common transatlantic agenda on these issues. And that doesn't mean that we will agree on everything, but I think now is really time to think of these challenges together and not as a division of labor issue. So that was one of the messages I really wanted to put out there. The other issue I think that won't go away is, of course, the burden sharing issue. We've talked about the 2% target. That is something that we will continue to be, that will continue to be at the heart of the transatlantic tensions and conversations. But then you've asked also a key question that we didn't answer yet, which is, will we be able to keep with these promises to raise defense spending and proceed with expensive reforms under the pressure of the COVID pandemic? I think this question is absolutely key, because the COVID has drastically changed the policy context within and beyond Europe. The focus on both sides of the Atlantic will be much more focused on domestic politics, and we understand that, of course. But what we've seen actually is a reprioritization of existing funds that were allocated initially to defense and security to actually deal with the economic consequences of the COVID. And one example of that was, the drastic cuts in the so-called EU Defense Fund to be able to respond to the COVID crisis. So it's going to be very challenging to actually find a way of, keeping this trajectory that many of you here have underlined, which has been, this reinvestment in defense spending, this consciousness that defense and security is really something that Europeans really need to reinforce as Europeans, but also within the NATO organization. But once again, we are now caught in trying to manage the consequences of this COVID crisis. So that to me is really an important challenge, and that again, I think should be part of a transatlantic conversation. And lastly, on the NATO's reflection process and the EU's search for its strategic compass, I think basically what can we expect from it? I think it's more, I would say, more cohesion, if possible, more a sense of a more shared analysis of the international environment, of the challenges that we're facing. And as Europeans, to try to have a more unified approach to these challenges, because I think that the Biden administration will have very little patience for a divided Europe on many of the strategic priorities that it has already put out there, and the American administration will very much be expecting some clear responses from European partners. So that was my final thoughts on that, and I'll give you back the floor.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed for your comments there. I see we're moving very quickly along, and I want to get to some of these discussion points. And we're going to have a question from Nina Solja, who I believe is online and works for one of those NATO departments that I only heard about today. Nina, perhaps you could introduce yourself and which bit of NATO you're from.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Nina Soljan, and I'm a head of section in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division at NATO HQ in Brussels. So I had a section called NATO Affairs and Security Policy. So first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for their insightful and forward-looking commentary. I strongly agree that as the strategic landscape is changing and continually moving towards a new great power competition, and as transboundary threats and risks grow, NATO will be even more important to our security and prosperity, and that collective response is definitely crucial. Also, that adaptation will continue to be critical in moving forward, including being able to effectively work with our partners. Here I'd highlight that while it hasn't reached its full potential, it's noteworthy that in recent years, cooperation between NATO and the EU has in many ways almost become the norm across the board. Both organizations have launched their own internal reflection processes recently, as we heard, and I'd like to echo comments made by the Secretary General earlier today, as well as those heard from this panel regarding the importance of the ongoing NATO 2030 process. And we also have to think about how we can achieve complementarity and synergy between NATO 2030 and the strategic compass process within the EU. I have a question for Senator Johnson. So 2020, we talked about defense spending, and 2020 will be the 6th consecutive year of increased defense spending by European allies and Canada. You referred to it with an increase of 4.3% in real terms. So I wonder if you could speak to the perception amongst your congressional colleagues about whether things are moving in the right direction and at a pace which is satisfactory, and whether there is this concern that we mentioned that the economic downturn resulting from COVID will eventually negatively impact defense spending, especially now at a time when the threats are multifaceted and even growing. And also, as our host asked, what about capabilities and contributions? And if I may, a question for Dr. de Hoop-Scheffer. A natural consequence of the fact that the alliance is faced with multiple threats is that there are divergent threat perceptions and priorities among allies. So how can we assure that in spite of this, unity and cohesion are maintained, including on both sides of the Atlantic? This would be my questions to the panel. Thank you very much.
So that's over to you, Ron Johnson. Is there an awareness of the amount of pressure that budgets are going to be under in terms of defense spending?
Well, there always is. And in the U.S., we have a divided nation. I think it's pretty obvious. And it's divided, in this case, between Democrats and Republicans. Democrat administrations have generally not focused on military spending. They've hollowed out our military. And then the next, whether it's Reagan having to build the defense budget back up, and then Clinton let it decline again, and President Bush had to build the defense spending back up, and then President Obama hollowed out the military, and then President Trump had to build it back up. So that's just a natural tendency. So there is disagreement within Congress. I think there's a total agreement by the part of the American public that with we're spending right now a little under 4%. The fact that President Trump called on Europe to step up the plate and honor the commitment of 2%, that's not President Trump saying that. He's representing what the vast majority of Americans are asking as well. And I would say, to answer your question right after I gave my remarks, from my standpoint, how the money is spent is as, if not more important than how much money is spent. And I understand the conflict between self-defense and collective defense. In an ideal world, you could make those things match perfectly, but they don't. So I think it's extremely important for our NATO partners and the United States to work very closely together, recognizing everybody's need for self-defense, but within that context, to spend that money well collectively, so that we don't have duplication of efforts, so that we have military equipment that operates cooperatively with each other, should we have to go, use military force.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So over to you, Alexandra. I think the question was, and I paraphrasing it, is every nation has a different idea of what a threat and what security is. Is it possible to gain some kind of commonality, of what the threat landscape is like amongst so many nations? Is it possible to get that consensus, and therefore where the capabilities need to be and the focus needs to be?
I mean, that's the key question. I would say you will never change the threat perception of a country. These threat perceptions are based on history, they're based on geography, and you clearly see that. I mean, France obviously is very focused on the south, as you can see, with a hyperactive diplomacy and initiatives in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in Africa, the fight against terrorism. Poland, where we have an office as well, is very focused, of course, on Russia. Germany is in between, with also a sort of consciousness of the importance also of being maybe more involved in Africa and supporting France. But again, you have different geographies, different perceptions. You won't change that. So the question is, how do you create solidarity despite these different threat perceptions? And that's absolutely key. And you've seen this sort of intra-European or intra-NATO solidarities. France is engaged, in the deterrence measures in the eastern flank and involved in the Baltic states, while you have, Estonia helping France in the Sahel counterterrorism. So that's the sort of, I would say, solidarity that you have seen these last couple of years. But what's also interesting is that these different threat perceptions also shape the diverging perceptions about the role of the United States and the role of NATO vis-a-vis European security and defense issues. All of that is linked. And so the more you move eastwards, the more the perception of the US role in European security and defense is vital and existential. And the more you move westwards, as I can say, and it's specifically true in France, the less you have this feeling of a vital link to the US or to NATO. And that again fuels into these different perceptions that we have within the alliance. But I'm absolutely sure, and this is, I think, the priority of both the 2030 NATO process and the strategic compass within the EU framework, is to create solidarity and a broad common vision of the big challenges that we face as European and transatlantic allies. And that shouldn't be such a challenge at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, we did promise that we would have some questions submitted through, I presume, the website. And top of the list, should we not move to a new cooperation paradigm between NATO and the European Union in crisis management, combining what each does best? Now, I suspect the person who has the greatest of insight on this is likely to be you, Baiba. Could you comment on that?
Well, NATO's tasks are very clearly defined in the current strategic concepts, actually, which is a collective defense, crisis management, and collective security. So in that respect, yes, crisis management is right there. Also, we have to remember is that we do work very well together with the EU on everyday basis in a variety of spectrums. And in the future, that will be even more. Having said that, we do have to remember that within the alliance, only 20% of the defense spending comes from the EU allies. So 80% is from the non-EU allies of NATO. And we also have to remember that more than half of NATO's populations live outside of the EU. So NATO is a unique organization where the EU countries are part of it. Obviously, there are EU members that are not NATO members and very close to the Baltic states, including. But having said that, when we think about the military capabilities and when we think about what EU is developing currently, it's very important that non-EU NATO allies have access to them. We cannot have two sets of capabilities that are developed in parallel. So that, I think, both for the European Defence Fund programs, for your European Industrial Program, and also for PESCO in the future, it will be very important. So we welcome the arrangement on PESCO with open arms. So hopefully that will work. Looking at the threats and looking at the capabilities that are beyond military, and especially on the areas where the EU is stronger or where the EU has its unique sort of regulatory power, obviously, again, it's very important that there is a mutual understanding that it does not affect NATO negatively, be it on the export controls for cyber tech that the EU is developing, be it on the new trade arrangements, be it on emerging disruptive technologies. It's actually, NATO is a platform where we should jointly with our European allies look at the future. Another issue, resilience. When we think again on about the threats such as cyber or disinformation or anything else that is beyond below Article 5, there is no just military answer. It's a whole society answer. It's about the rule of law. It's about individuals that are empowered. It's about our civil society organizations. It's about empowering basically our societies to deal with these threats. And here we do have to work together very, very, very closely, because those threats affect democratic societies, Western societies, political West, global democratic sort of community in the same way. And what we are looking at NATO currently is also how to strengthen the resilience. We have sort of resilience baselines, which are mostly around the critical infrastructure and the ability of the governments to recover from major shocks, such as pandemic, for example. And they deal mostly with critical infrastructure, as I said, such as telecommunications or the ability of the governments to provide health services, efficient communication services. But beyond that, when we look at the societies, it's not just about critical infrastructure. It is about how we at the citizens level, at this societal level, enable resistance to these external threats. And so this is where the governments, the private sector, and the whole society really needs to come together and work together.
Thank you, Baiba. Question for you, Ron Johnson. Do you, in your view, do you have a clear idea of where the competencies of the NATO and the European Union overlap in crisis management?
Not really. I can't really add much to that, but I can answer your question in terms of sanctions that you raised again early on. I do question how effective sanctions are. There's always a concern I have in Congress. Russia bad, sanctions good. And from my standpoint, the purpose of sanctions is first to try and change Russia's behavior. But if you can't do that and it doesn't look like we've been particularly effective at changing their behavior, at least not do anything that enhances their position, increases their influence, increases their power, which is one of the reasons I've certainly been strongly against the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That just doesn't make any sense. I think most NATO partners agree. But this is one of those areas where there's disagreement between NATO partners. It's going to be the ongoing conflict and tension between independent nation states and their own personal interests versus the collective interest, which is always a problem. But I think we need to be smart at how we spend money. I think we need to be smart in terms of how we structure our defense posture between nations, what our capabilities are, and that we use them accordingly. I think we need to be smart when we use those collective sanctions at trying to change behavior of the malign interests and the malign actions of people like nations like Russia and China.
Well, the comment that you made about getting sovereign nations to agree together brings me on to my next question for Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer, which is this idea of strategic autonomy. And von der Leyen has raised the issue of consensus versus majority voting, and how the EU takes a strategic or foreign policy position, which it's increasingly looking to do. And I wonder how the European Union is going to get agreement on what it means by strategic autonomy. I mean, I'm looking at the German defense minister quoted a couple of weeks ago, the illusions of European strategic autonomy must come to an end. So there's great disagreements over what strategic autonomy means, autonomy from whom, for instance. And I wonder do you think we'll ever be able to resolve that substantially enough to be able to move on?
I think the concept of strategic autonomy is an issue for many European countries, precisely for the reason you just mentioned, which is that it's strategic autonomy from who. And I think we should, take some distance from that part, from who, and rather think of strategic autonomy to do what and to achieve what. I think that's the real issue here, and that would lead Europeans to focus much more on the concrete aspects of strategic autonomy instead of debating about the concept. Now, I know that the new concept à la mode is now sovereignty, and that we have a few countries pushing for the concept of European sovereignty. But again, it's not really the same. It doesn't really translate the same idea. And again, and as I was saying, we need to think of being more, what does it mean? It's to be more autonomous, more capable, more able as Europeans to respond to certain crises especially when the United States will not be there and will say, sorry, this is not a US vital interest, or when, again, the NATO framework is maybe not the best framework to respond to this or that crisis. And basically because NATO is a military alliance, and that in particular, in the southern flank of the alliance can be an issue. And so in these types of settings, what do? And you need to anticipate, and you will have more of these hybrid, low intensity, maybe high intensity crisis. Well, we will have to be very reactive and anticipate together. And that's why the French, initiative for European intervention initiative that was launched by President Macron just two and a half years ago was exactly responding to that need to gather countries that are willing and able to share a common strategic culture, to also learn from one another and to anticipate together scenarios where that type of capability will be necessary in case neither the NATO framework works, or in case the United States says, sorry, but we have many other issues to tackle. This is a European affair. And the Libya experience, I remember I was working at the French Foreign Ministry at that time in 2011, the message coming from Washington under the Obama administration was extremely clear. They were saying, this is your mess, this is a European business. We are going to lead from behind, we're going to support you, but we will not be in the leader's seat. And these scenarios will become more and more, frequent. So we need to anticipate. That's basically, I would say, the very simple definition of what is strategic autonomy. And it's not autonomy from the United States or anti-NATO concept. It's something that can be used in broader context.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for this session today. I'd like to thank each of our contributors for taking their time to join us and offer their insights. Senator Ron Johnson, thank you very much. Ambassador Baiba Braj from Brussels, thank you. And Dr. Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, Anna Fatiga's headed back to look after the review. I'm Ben Heap. This has been NATO Relevance. Thank you and goodbye.